Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. From the first moment the armored walker ungracefully stumbled onto the battlefield, it had armies of critics waiting for this platform to stumble and fall straight onto its face. Some would point out that the lanky legs on this vehicle were clear weak points for the enemy to attack. You never want to paint an easy target on your armored unit for enemy gunners to key in on. Others would ask why use such a complicated and hard to maintain propulsion system, especially in a world where you have repulsor lifts or even tracked and wheeled vehicles. Others would point out just how tall and unwieldy these vehicles were and how they attracted fire from every direction from miles away. And honestly, I would agree with a lot of these statements. Maybe I should make a separate video for that side of the argument, but ever since the old Republic days, people have been predicting the downfall of the Walker, and you know what, 4,000, 5,000 years later, it's still around. I still remember in 3963 BBY when the Neo Crusader Mandalorians got a little bit too excited and then accidentally shot hundreds of nukes at the surface of the planet Sirocco, turning the Republic ground army stationed there into molten radioactive slag. Everyone was running around in circles screaming, "Oh, this is the end of the ground army. This is the end of the Walker tank. Spend your money on something else like navies. If you can't control orbit, you can't control anything." Yet 200 years later, both the Old Republic and the Sith Empire were ferrying around their troops in the Menka-class armored transport, and it saw action in 3 major wars. Heck, they even took it to Terrace, another, world that was basically blown up from orbit. Turns out armored walkers are perfect against Rakghouls. And thousands of years later, after an extended period of peace when the Republic militarized and fought against the Confederacy of Advanced Systems, what did they rely on again? A walker. The all-terrain tactical enforcer was one of the most relied on vehicles and beloved vehicles by the clones on the battlefield. And so today I'm going to do the impossible. I'm going to defend this very unwieldy and weird-looking vehicle, and we're going to talk about situations where it actually is quite useful and why the Empire and the Republic and many other factions use these type of vehicles. Even the Separatists had their own walkers, if you think about it. And, in order to really understand this argument, you just have to change your point of view and think about things from a different perspective. Let's start off with the elephant in the room, the gigantic ATAT, or all-terrain armored transport used by the early Empire, and then they had a second variant for the late Empire. Perhaps one of the most ridiculed vehicles in the entire galaxy, other than the Cloud Car and the Tesla Cybertruck. Now, according to the literature, these vehicles were anywhere from 20 to 22.5 meters in height, depending on the variant. And it said that this walker's height was mainly due to its predecessor, the ATTE's susceptibility to landmines. But honestly, I call shenanigans on it. The Empire defeated all the other conventional armies in the galaxy. The only faction that's going to be laying landmines is them. So I don't think landmines is an issue. Now, roadside boom booms and, improvised explosive devices, that might be a problem. Especially with Saw Gerrera's partisans running around with all that Jedi training during the last war.
The Milan anti-tank missile.
We've got 300 in the field.
Yep. Let's kill some.
The Separatist.
I guess the Jedi get the last laugh in a way. It's a sad laugh. By the way, I got some lightsabers and Padawan braids for sale in the back if you guys are interested. Now, I think there's another reason why these AT-ATs are that tall. It's a much more practical reason. You see, 20 meters or so is equal to the height of a 5 to 6 story building, which also happens to be one of the most common heights for medium-sized apartment buildings in most of the galaxy. Now, seriously, if you go to the downtown, more built-up Main Street in almost every city in the world that isn't a major urban center with skyscrapers, and 5 to 6 stories is going to be your max height. So why is the AT-AT at this height? Well, to understand the Empire's vehicle designs, you have to understand their mindset. Their crazy, insecure mindset. Half the things they built weren't even for combat. Combat was a secondary function that was kind of cool, just like how, when you buy a G-Wagon, you're not really going to be taking it out into the woods or in the backcountry to do some mudding, although you could. The AT-AT is not really built to assault a heavily mined or fortified enemy position, even though it did quite well during the Battle of Hoth. If you look at its name, it's really just an armored transport, right? But its primary purpose, like a lot of Imperial vehicles, was first and foremost to intimidate potential enemies of the Empire, including its own citizens who might become dissidents or rebel. So don't think of the ATAT as a main battle tank, it's not. Don't even think about it as an IFV, infantry fighting vehicle, even though it's actually equipped a little bit better to do the latter. The second version of the ATAT could carry up to 40 troops along with several speeder bikes. What the ATAT was designed for originally is not all that different from what those mobile police towers you see at major sporting events and concerts were designed for: surveillance and deterrence. And as one of the wisest men in Star Wars once said,
"It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!"
Not only is having the high ground intimidating, it gives you a great view of the entire battlefield. It also keeps you somewhat safe, especially if you're not expecting people to take pot shots at you, which generally is not a thing when you're policing an area and not in a war zone. These ATATs are essentially observation posts that can be moved around to different parts of a city. You can post up an officer in the command center or a cockpit, and you can coordinate troops on the ground and help with crowd control. Because there's giant lasers that go pew pew. I mean, if you actually saw one of these things near you, the scale alone would be terrifying and make you question any kind of shady stuff you were originally planning. I mean, it's one thing to ambush a tank while it's on the ground floor, and maybe you're on the top floor and you got some Molotovs or RPGs. It seems doable. It seems almost fun, but don't let intrusive thoughts win, Steve. It's not worth your life. It's a whole different ordeal to have to scale up a 20-meter high moving vehicle so that you can attack it. You know, the Empire was literally flexing muscles in order to intimidate people and make them think twice about carrying out an attack. That is what the Tarkin Doctrine was all about. And here's the thing, when the people did start rebelling and insurgencies started popping out all over the place, the AT-AT provided something very unique for the Empire that a lot of other vehicles just didn't have. Take a look at this ambush on Jeddah. The Empire has a platoon of troopers escorting a tracked TX-225 occupier tank through one of the more crowded squares. Saw's partisans have set up a pretty chaotic ambush. It's definitely not textbook. You know, first of all, too many civilians around. It's unethical, and then they're not exactly lined up in the right way. There's some dangerous crossfires going on during this battle. Then you have those dudes hopped up on spice, jumping out of cover, exposing themselves, and trading fire with the troopers at point blank range. But still, the partisans managed to win out the day, and that's because the partisans are using the verticality of the environment to their favor. They have marksmen perched up top, and the detonator that is thrown that launches this ambush is also thrown from the roof. If you had an AT-AT, those guys on the roof would have looked really stupid. So by having that height advantage, you immediately cut access off to all the roofs in this area, and that makes your convoy on the ground that much safer. And you can also deploy troopers on top of the AT-AT, or you could have a variant where this is a double-decked vehicle, by the way. So like you could have firing slots maybe out the side that could give you even more coverage. Because actually one of the weaknesses with this design is that the vehicle's firepower is all located around the cockpit. So the sides, the bottom, the rear are kind of vulnerable. But still, having that kind of height, that kind of situational awareness, along with that mobility in an urban environment, it's just unprecedented. It's a great design for that one specific purpose. Also, if someone tries to create a roadblock or there's just debris in the street, as was common with urban battlefields, you know, the AT-AT walker can just step right over that debris or even crush it with its foot. It's a lot better and safer than trying to plow through it with your tank, either a hover tank or a wheeled or tracked vehicle, because very likely that rubble might also have explosives in it. Everything can blow up in these kind of environments. And since the Empire was mostly facing just civilians with small arms and the occasional detonator, there really weren't any types of weapons that could even damage the more vulnerable joints in the legs. And even if the rebels managed to get some shoulder-fired rocket munitions or some larger explosives, you still have to get a lucky strike on the joints of the legs of this walker to take it down. And I think it really is worth exposing these vehicles to that risk because of the advantages that they bring you. I mean, a lot of tanks in urban warfare, first of all, I think a lot of countries have changed their doctrine in recent years and they just don't use main battle tanks in built-up areas anymore. But a lot of these vehicles, they have very thin and light armor on their roofs. And so if you can get a vertical advantage as a guerrilla fighter, you can launch rockets, all sorts of hell onto the top of those things and destroy them very easily. So the AT-AT is really a solution to that. You one-up the enemy by bringing your own high ground, which is something, again, that Obi-Wan Kenobi would love. The Empire in the earlier years of the war really had a monopoly over the kind of heavy firepower that was needed to completely destroy an AT-AT or just challenge it. I mean, look at how creative the rebels had to get in Hoth to just take a few of these things down. Not even their shipborne weapons or larger blaster turrets could dent this thing. The ATAT just marched across the frozen tundra and then walked all over the Rebels, just like how the Niners walk all over the Packers every year at the NFC Championship. And the craziest thing about the situation is the Rebs saw them coming. They could see these ATATs from miles away, and no matter how much artillery they called in on these platforms, very few of them could be brought down. Look, the legs are vulnerable. We see how the snow speeders are able to basically wrap, some type of wire around their legs and trip them up, but if you want a vehicle that's this tall because of those tactical advantages we talked about, the only way to do it is with legs, with walkers. Take a look at most repulsor craft, speeders. They're quite light and small for a reason. It takes actually a lot of energy to keep a repulsor lift going. The only reason why Cloud City existed financially was because it was over the gas giant Bespin and they were mining Tibanna gas, which of course can fuel the repulsor lifts. And with larger vessels like the Acclimator class assault ship, if you just took out one of their main engines while the ship was in orbit, the repulsor lifts couldn't keep the ship up and the entire thing would come crashing down. Same thing goes with the ISD and the Venator. I mean, these massive ships had to burn a lot of fuel just to hover over a city and look cool and not crash, which is not cool. It's for the same reason why the armored assault tank, despite being half the size of the ATTE, is 5 kilometers per hour slower. And even then, the medium tank seems to be pushing the limits of its engine quite a lot. This is why most heavier vehicles in Star Wars either use wheels, like the Juggernaut tank, or tracks, like the Occupier tank we mentioned, or legs, like the self-propelled heavy artillery platform. And also, judging by what we see with the all-terrain tactical enforcer, I actually think that walkers are far more mobile and can get to more random places than an AAT ever could. I mean, forget the fact that the ATTE has magnetic clamps for legs and can scale up vertical cliff faces. Repulsor tanks, especially ones as heavy as the armored assault tank, are not going to be able to fly up in the air several meters. You might have a bit more tolerance, but you're still going to be hugging the ground. And so you're not going to be that much more mobile than, say, a tractor-wheeled vehicle. I mean, as far as getting stuck in like mud or sand or some other kind of difficult terrain, that's not going to happen to the hover tank. But if there's an obstacle, like a car or a rock or a wall of some kind, you can't just fly over the thing. This is why the AAT specifically has a battering ram designed in the front of its hull. This thing goes through things. It doesn't go over them. In our last video, we did a breakdown of the ATTE versus the AAT, and we found that both platforms have their own great qualities. But the AAT functions a lot like a traditional tank would. I mean, the turret design is a little wonky, but it's basically a tank. It's great at firing accurately while moving, thanks to the stable platform. The entire vehicle is well armored, especially in the front, which gives the vehicle more protection when charging an enemy position. But the ATTE is far more like a rock climber with a gigantic gun on its shoulder. It's not really an assault vehicle, although it can serve as one. You're going to have far better results if you deploy the ATTE in a very deliberate way and put it into a firing position that ideally is prepared. I mean, this thing can get almost anywhere, especially if you have an LAAT with you. Also, we talked about this in our last video. The ATTE turret is unprotected, but it has a great amount of depression and elevation, which means, again, you have a lot more mobility, you have a lot more flexibility at firing from high vertical areas. Also, I took a look at the top speed of the ATTE. Actually, it's not as ridiculous as I made it out to be in my last video. I mean, what's really going on here is not that the ATTE is really fast, but the hover tank is surprisingly slow. An ATTE with a top speed of 60 kilometers per hour translates to around 37 miles per hour, and that's around the top speed of a Challenger 2 tank on the road. And thanks to Alec Baldwin, who apparently is one of my subscribers, he reminded us that there's actually an inertial compensator in the ATTE, which means that there's going to be a lot of stability if the walker is running. This is a thing that they put in starfighters, to keep people from feeling G-force. So, yeah, I mean, that'd be really interesting to see one of these things galloping in live action. I feel like a lot of certain types of fans would complain that this is not Star Wars and they're ruining their favorite vehicle. But us lore nerds, we know that an ATTE on a good day can run down a freaking Challenger 2 tank and also mount it like a wildebeest in heat. Absolutely terrifying. Here at Generation Tech, we specialize at creating nightmares that you didn't know could happen. Anyway, other people have said that the AAT is going to be a lot better crossing over water, but I actually don't think that's how these repulsor lifts work. I think they're more attached to the elevation of the ground, and so if you go into deep water, the AAT is just going to submerge itself. which is probably not a good thing. However, the ATAT, as we see in the Jedi Survivor during the Kashyyyk mission, can definitely wade through shallow straits and can legitimately perform an amphibious assault that is very impressive to see. I mean, this is one of the most difficult type of military operations, fording a river or establishing a beachhead. With an ATAT, you don't need to float around in the water. You're not like, at the mercy of the waves. You don't have to build a bridge and be exposed in that way. You just wade through. And lastly, I do have to say, when compared to a tracked or wheeled vehicle, a walker system, if it's as durable as the designers at Rothana Heavy Engineering say it is, well, it's going to be able to operate in far more crazier and stickier environments. I mean, if you take a look at our own world, tank warfare more or less is restricted to the roads, especially during the spring thaw or any kind of wet season when there's a lot of rain in like open fields and stuff like that. During these periods of time, anything lighter than a Toyota Hilux is just not going anywhere. Doesn't really matter what kind of engine you have or what kind of treads. Mud season is mud season. Meanwhile, the trusty ATTE is going to be able to wade through swamps and suddenly make a whole new area of the battlefield accessible for you, which is really what this platform's key advantage is. And remember, guys, the Republic and the Empire both had repulsor tanks. They just weren't used as much or seen as much as the walkers were. The ATTE, again, was an infantry fighting vehicle for more heavy engagements when you need speed on your side. You have something like the TX-130, which the clones have said handles like a Delta 7 Ether Sprite light interceptor, which is honestly just crazy when you hear it said out loud. So yeah, I'm not saying that a walker will win you the entire war. I'm not saying that you should, build progressively larger walkers like the creatively bankrupt First Order. Talk about an 800-pound gorilla. But here on this channel, we like to talk about things the way we see it. And sometimes that might go against conventional thinking. And we especially like taking on issues where everyone is hating on something unnecessarily. I mean, what can I say? We like to be the saviors of the broken, the beaten, and the damned. And to me, walkers are cool and pretty unconventional. I challenge you to change my mind.